Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Jeff Demers. I'm the assistant to the dean here at the law school, and let me be the first to welcome you to our school. I've had the pleasure of emailing and calling and meeting in person many of you, and it's been a complete pleasure. So very pleased that you're here. We're going to be talking about a timely topic today that I know many of you have dedicated your lives to studying. And the school is grateful that you're here to talk about these important subjects, and we will do our part to get the word out about what you have to say today. We're going to do that in a variety of methods. We're going to make the entire video proceedings of the conference available online. The proceedings, the written proceedings will be available in book form after the event, published by Cambridge Scholars Press over in England. And of course, we'll think, if you have any other ideas on how to get the word out about this event, we're all ears for sure. If at any point during the event you have any questions, I'm here to help, and we have a full staff here to answer any inquiries that you might have. And at this point, it's really my pleasure to introduce our dean, who's going to give today's opening address. And I've worked at the school for about 8 months, and in my time here, I've enjoyed it greatly, and this is a school that cares deeply about intellectualism, about furthering the tradition of learning outside of the classroom, and it's a real honor to introduce the president of our school for the opening address, Dean Lawrence Velvel.
Well, I don't know about it being such an honor to introduce me. It reminds me of Mr. Finley Peter Dunn's cartoon about the two fellows going to the electric chair, and one said to the other, if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I would just as soon not. But let me say to you, first of all, thank you for attending. Last night we had a dinner for some of the out-of-town faculty, and it was evident that there was tremendous energy in the room. People who have worked in the same, the hackneyed word would be vineyards, but these have not proven to be vineyards, have they? Have worked in the same field for nigh on to 30 and 40 years in some antique cases like myself, although I had a long hiatus, and who only too rarely get to see each other and talk to each other in person. And so I hope that you enjoy your time here, as well as that, this ought to be, I hope, a very profitable, at least intellectually stimulating and intellectually profitable time. One of the reasons, of course, why we're so delighted to have you here is because the subject to be discussed, ever-increasing presidential power, is one which simply refuses to go away, which is a, excuse the language, that is a damn shame, is it not? It gets ever worse over the years. And as I said, there are people in this room who have been fighting the good fight on this subject for 30 years or more. I first got involved when my then brother-in-law, that's a lawyer's way to say that somebody was your brother-in-law at the time, my then brother-in-law, Sidney Kleinman from Chicago, who is sitting over there, said to me about 1966 or 1967, when I had gone into the academic world, and he figured, well, the guy's a professor, he's got nothing better to do. He suggested to me that I consider whether anything could be done in the courts about the abomination known as the Indochina War. And I investigated whether anything could be done in the courts, and after 5 years of writing articles and writing a book and litigating case after case, I gave up in defeat, admitted that there was nothing to be done in the courts, and went on to other things. Curiously enough, you know, Kleinman in German must mean, I suppose, small man. And one of the people who's with us today is named Kleinerman. So we have small man and smaller man here. But anyhow, I got involved in this in 1966 or 7 due to the misbegotten efforts of my brother-in-law, who deserves all the blame for this, but refuses to take any of it. After Vietnam, of course, I left. I did other things until Iraq came around, and then, horridly enough, we seem to be replaying history once again. About the time that I was getting involved or giving it up, a number of other people also got involved who have been involved for many years, and some of them are here today. Some of them I've even had the good fortune to meet over the course of the years. For example, Lou Fisher is with us today, who has been involved almost as long as I was. Well, he's been involved longer, except that he's been doing it continuously. I consider Lou to be the lawyer who, as a lawyer, is the country's premier expert on separation of powers. Another person who will be here today, or at least is scheduled to be here today, is Julius Lobel. And Jules Lobel. Jules, along with his colleague at the Center for Constitutional Rights, that is the organization which spearheaded the Guantanamo case. I can remember, by the way, to digress, I can remember when the Center for Constitutional Rights couldn't get private lawyers to help it with any of its cases. It was regarded as far too left-wing. I was there. I sat once at the desk of William Kunstler and wrote a brief. I mean, William Kunstler, that's pretty far out to the left for those days, folks. Probably most of you don't even know who William Kunstler was. At least some of you don't know who he was. But Jules, along with his colleague Michael Ratner and with some other folks, including people who are supposed to be here today, has been over the course of the years, I think, probably the premier litigator in this country on the question of the international legality and constitutional legality of various presidential military actions. And then there are some others I've met over the years, like Bob Mann, who is going to be addressing us. And then, there are a lot of others of you whom I never had the pleasure of meeting before, who have been in the trenches of presidential power for 20, 30 years. And we will be hearing from all of you today. And I'm sure that people will benefit from what you have to say. As I look out, I see Peter Irons. We have never met before. He's written book after book on this subject, article after article, work after work, I guess one might encompassingly say. It is true that we had a 1-hour phone call one day, but that's about the extent to which we have known each other. So, as I say, a lot of the people who are in this room have been working on this subject for a long time. But it is deeply depressing to say that all their enormously talented efforts have not yet succeeded, and who knows if they will ever succeed, in reining in unchecked presidential power, have not yet succeeded in causing presidential power to become consonant with what the founders of this country intended with respect to the divisions of power in the federal government, with respect to the extent of power in the executive itself, and with regard to what is necessary and what the founders in particular thought necessary to the preservation of liberty. And I have to say, apropos of this unhappy lack of success, which I spearheaded by being the first to fail regularly and miserably, due to this lack of success, we are here. Had this assemblage of talent been successful, we would not be here. If they had succeeded as in justice, they would have succeeded. If there were any justice, we would not be here. But we are here, and at least in part because, as they say, in this writer's opinion, or in one man's opinion, this nation is undergoing a crisis of its governing structure, just as we underwent such a crisis during the period of the Vietnam War. And in this respect, let me again digress very briefly to tell you another personal story. The story about my brother-in-law was a personal story, after all. Tell you another personal story, which I think tells a little bit about the United States. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, after leaving the lists of Vietnam, I was, although I worked in Washington, part of a very large litigation team that was litigating a huge antitrust case in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's hard to believe that they had huge antitrust cases in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but by gum, they did. It involved a default judgment of $300 million. Back in 1980, $300 million was more money than even Bill Gates had. And one of the members of the team was a fellow who, whether one considers it from the local standpoint in Santa Fe or whether one considers it objectively, was some shakes. He came from comes from a very prominent New Mexico family. He had an uncle who was a federal appellate court judge. He himself was a graduate of Princeton University. There is nobody who thinks better of their university and remembers it more fondly than graduates of Princeton who equal graduates of Michigan in their Michigas, if you understand the phrase, in their craziness on this matter. He was, I think, first in his class at the Stanford Law School, which equips him, I guess, to compete with William Rehnquist, the departed William Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor. And ultimately, he became a Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court of New Mexico. So you can see that this was a person to be reckoned with. And one evening over drinks, this member of our litigation team told me that he had disagreed with my view that Vietnam had been a constitutional crisis. He knew that I had felt that way. Indeed, a book that I authored was subtitled The American System in Crisis. And he told me that he had disagreed with this, but he had changed his mind. The reason he had changed his mind was because he had, I think, gone back to Princeton and had heard Edward S. Corwin, the great constitutional scholar, speak about Vietnam, and Corwin had called it a constitutional crisis. Or if he didn't go back and hear Corwin say it in person, he read where Corwin said it. But I think he went back and heard Corwin say it in person. And if Corwin said it, it must be true. And therefore, this fellow had changed his mind, which was another lesson. One of my first lessons, sad to say, descriptive of naivete as that is. Another example of that in America, it really isn't whether you are right or wrong, objectively or analytically. It is whether the big shots say you're right. And I think that to a certain extent, the people in this room have fought this battle in the face of so many big shots saying, all of us, all of you, me, we are wrong. When analytically and objectively, I don't think that's true at all. Well, so much for that digression. Let me return to what I have called the crisis of our governing structure, which is the way I see what's going on. I think the sum of it is that our government has gotten way out of whack. It has become very unbalanced, with the president usurping, and I use the word advisedly, usurping what sometimes amounts to dictatorial power, as occurred in Vietnam, and with a threat of more usurpation, as again occurred with regard to Vietnam. And let me briefly enumerate some of the matters that, at least in my judgment, comprise this usurpation. You will hear far more about a lot of them. My description will be brief. You will hear a lot more about a lot of them from the panelists. And indeed, let me say this. It is precisely to give the people you will hear from an opportunity to state their views in a public conference, in a public forum, where DVDs are going to be made and made available to any professor or anybody who wants to use them for any purpose, where it will be put on the internet and it will be downloadable into iPods as well as viewable on computers, where a book will be compiled of the talks and the panel discussions here. It was precisely to give such people a chance to state their views in that kind of public forum that this conference is being held. You know, the John Hughes and the Dick Cheneys and the George Bushes of this world get to say what they want, get to say what they think all the time, and the press hangs on their every word, no matter how false, no matter how dangerous. It is, I must say that 2 days ago, I simply could not stop myself. You know, stop me before I kill again kind of idea. I could not stop myself from listening to John Yoo on the Tom Ashbrook show, which goes out all over New England, over much of the country on NPR or public radio. And I couldn't tear myself away as long as I drove in the car. Thank God I got home and had to turn off the radio. You know, these guys he was opposed, I must say, fortunately, by Joshua Dratell, who some of you may know the name. He's a leading figure on the liberal side of this matter. I guess you would call it the liberal political side of this matter. But the John Hughes of this world get to have their say all the time. I thought it was time for some other people to get to have their say in a public forum, a non-printed public forum, although it will be printed later. Now, let me say that with regard to our governing structure, and I will tell you up front, my views on this could be considered extremely harsh. I also think they're extremely accurate. You know, Henry Kissinger once said, the fact that one is paranoid does not mean that one does not have enemies. And I would say the fact that one is extremely harsh does not mean that one is not right. But you'll have to judge for yourself the extent to which it's right or wrong. Let me say to begin with that the presidential power has been aggrandized to an extent that the founders of this country could not have dreamed of, not in their craziest moments. In this respect, as Justice Jackson said in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube case, much of what Justice Jackson said in that case very sagely is deliberately forgotten or overlooked, you know, by people in the courts and who write about these things. But as he said in Youngstown Sheet and Tube, the power of the president has been aggrandized dramatically, in part because of the rise of the party system. He is the head of the party, and because of the power of the mass media. And I think Jackson also said that as head of his party, he often can get what he could not get simply by his position in the governmental structure. So we have the mass media, we have the party system. Also sad to say the presidential power has been aggrandized because presidents have shown that they are not loath to lie in order to get what they want. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is probably our country's worst single example of that, and WMDs follow close in train. Then too, and Bob Mann might have something to say about this because I think he might disagree with me fairly strongly about this, but I'm not sure. There is the collapse of Congress as a body deserving of respect. It has descended into being a group who collectively care only for pork and re-election, have managed to jury-rig the system so that most of them are re-elected most of the time, and is comprised too heavily, in the leadership especially, of people who, dare we say it, are grafters, bribe takers, corrupt, and who I think are palsied when one suggests they do the right thing. I don't have to tell you what's going on in the news, what you're reading in the newspapers every day. Then there is the mass media, and I apologize to people like Charlie Savage, whom I regard as a remarkable exception to what I'm about to say. There is the mass media, which I regard as extensively incompetent, particularly if you watch television, fearful, lusting for coverage of the most banal presidential actions. Did he whack weeds on his ranch today? This is really news, is it not? To rarely ask the crucial questions or uncover the crucial actions, as one of our panelists, Charlie Savage, did. And I guess for that will forever be regarded as savage, correct? In this regard, it is not generally known, and still less is it remembered, although I think it should never be forgotten, that the New York Times, admittedly this country's leading newspaper, not only contributed by its negligent reporting to taking this country into war, but refuses to this day to say whether it knew of the NSA's electronic spying on American citizens before the election of November 2004. Refuses to this day to discuss it, even though, if it knew of it and failed to disclose it, it may have altered the election. Bush won by 3 million votes. lot of those might have been changed, and it only would have taken a change of 60,000 votes in Ohio to make the difference, but the Times did not report it, and instead it held it for another year. I consider this so important. I was going to say so terrible. I consider it that too. So important and so generally unremarked that I'm going to read you something which Tom Powers said in a review, a very lengthy review in the New York Review of Books of James Risen's recent book called State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration. Now, for those of you who don't know Powers, along with Risen, who's a Johnny-come-lately, comparatively speaking, and I think James Bamford, who's written 2 books that comprise the history and tell the detail of the NSA. Powers is probably, with those 2 other gentlemen, one of the 3 most important and influential, I don't know, one of the 3 most important writers on intelligence matters today. And here's what Powers said in a review of Risen's book. Quote, "An early version of the story was apparently submitted to the Times editors in October 2004 when it might have affected the outcome of the presidential election, but the Times, for reasons it is not clearly explained, withheld the story until mid-December 2005. Now, Powers does not say how he knows all of this or how he found it out, but if Tom Powers says it, you cannot ipso facto blithely dismiss it. And if they knew about this story in October 2004, I've read everything that Bill Keller said about it. I think Tom Powers is being kind when he says has not clearly explained. I think clearly dodged would be a more accurate description. So there is the mass media. Then there are the courts, the bailiwick of some of the people who are in this room. Personally, my views of the courts are formed by 2 major cases, the whole Vietnam matter, taking all those cases as one, and a major case we had involving accreditation. My view of the courts is very bad, the federal courts anyway. So I tell you that so you understand my prejudice. But I do believe that they have lacked the courage, and I would say the wisdom, to rein in a president who is out of control with regard to military matters. They have, as people will discuss, in cases like Curtis Wright and its progeny, as the lawyers say, refused to stop illegal actions. When people think I should say when people wrongly think they have acted strongly, as some people wrongly have thought it about the Guantanamo case. Now, you can quarrel with those adjectives. The truth often is they have not acted strongly. I think everybody in the room can agree that the courts allow vast delegations of power to the executive. Under the most recent law of which I'm familiar, with, they do not even regard that there be an operative principle contained in the legislation. They can more or less say, here, Jack, you do it. They know that the way to go higher, lower court judges know, that the way to go higher in the judicial system is to play the executive's game. Let me tell you the most recent example. Again, unsung, unplumbed, not mentioned in the media, but the fact of the matter is that the current Chief Justice, when interviewing de facto for a position on the Supreme Court, while simultaneously sitting on the Guantanamo case as a Court of Appeals judge, simultaneously sitting on the Guantanamo case dear to the White House's heart, expressed views that obviously did not deter the White House, shall I put it that way? Did not deter the White House from nominating him to the Chief Justiceship. This, to me, I think this is very bad. I think it's almost as bad, not as bad, but almost as bad as the fact that, just to show you that this is not a politically partisan view that I'm putting forth. During the Vietnam War, as some of you will remember, a justice of the Supreme Court was a major hawk advisor to Lyndon Johnson. Some people say, I think wrongly, the principal advisor to Lyndon Johnson. but at minimum, he was a leading Hawk advisor to Lyndon Johnson, while simultaneously sitting on cases, which I lost, while simultaneously sitting on cases in which he voted for the Supreme Court not to hear the vital constitutional question of the legality of undeclared wars. And let me say, as some people in this room are deeply familiar with, Lou Fisher, among others, the courts, generally speaking, with one or two exceptions like Judge Diggs in Detroit, basically bow and scrape when the executive raises questions of executive privilege or state secrets. I'm tempted to paraphrase Roosevelt's comment about, which it would go something like this: doctrines which shall live in infamy. But the fact of the matter is that the state secrets doctrine, which Lou can comment on, he's just written a book about it, was conceived in fraud upon the courts by the executive branch, and I think often continues in that way. And one should never forget, by the way, another little-known fact, I think, that Erwin Griswold, the famed longtime dean of the Harvard Law School, notably a curmudgeon. He was always very nice to me, so I can only say good things about him. I did not go to Harvard, but I met him a few times. Erwin Griswold, who argued the government's Pentagon Papers case in the Supreme Court, later conceded there was nothing secret in those papers. They were, of course, one example of the government attempting to maintain what one could call a state secret. Then there are things which I have left more or less for last because they are among the most awful. There is the desire of the highest members of the executive branch to kidnap and torture people. People who sometimes have turned out, I gather, we can't know, but I gather by the dozens, scores, or hundreds to be innocent. And to hold them indefinitely, to try them before courts-martial precisely because, I will take credit for writing on this before anybody else was saying it, to hold them for courts-martial precisely because they knew that you could not get in that evidence in the civilian courts. And the only way you could get it in was before courts-martial, which has now to some extent been approved by Congress in the most recent law that it passed just a few days ago. A judge has got to make decisions about whether the probative, it's the usual legal falderall. Does the probative value outweigh the bad stuff, I guess would be one way to put it. But that's why they wanted to use, that's why they are using courts-martial. And let me say this, something else that the media refuses to discuss. Refuses in 2 words. There can no longer be any doubt, none at all, that the highest people in our government, George Bush in particular, knew about and desired the torture that was occurring. And indeed, Bush would ask people in the CIA whether the torture was succeeding in obtaining useful information. All of this became very clear first in an op-ed column written by Michael Scheuer, whom I presume a lot of you know who he is, in the New York Times about 1.5 years ago, and in James Risen's book, and most recently in Ron Suskind's book. There can no longer be any legitimate question that Bush knew and desired this. Now, of course, in his mind, he desired it for good and sufficient reasons. I'm simply saying that he desired it. There is another fact which nobody wants to think about, let alone mention, and which the media will not touch with the proverbial fork. And that is that this torture, at least unless and until it has been immunized, as some people think, and I fail to understand why, but I'm sure that's my ignorance, quite honestly. I've looked at the statute, I don't know where it is. Unless it has been immunized, even if it has been now been immunized, this torture was a very serious felony under American domestic law. You cannot get the news media to report that. It was so serious a felony that if somebody died under torture, if there was murder by torture, the person who did it could be punished by capital punishment. The co-conspirator, that would include the people who authorized and desired it and ordered it, would it not, could be punished by up to life in prison. For less than death, the punishment for the perpetrator was up to life imprisonment, and the punishment for the co-conspirator was 20 years in the pen. As Casey Stengel used to say, folks, you could look it up. That's in the statute books. Then one of my particular bêta noirs, I don't know how to pronounce that. I guess it's a French phrase, but it's so apt. Someday I'll have to learn how to pronounce it. I can spell it for you. There is the fact that the Justice Department, of which I was a member in the 1960s, low-ranking, but a member, in a time that some of us who are old people think was the heyday of the Department of Justice. That's probably wrong. That this Department of Justice, the lawyers there and the executive branch lawyers, the John Hughes, the Jay Bybes, the David Addingtons, the Alberto Gonzalezes, the William Hayneses, have become lapdogs for the president. They draft or approve memoranda that are legally indefensible and morally outrageous. These memoranda have approved torture, kidnapping, and mark this, and as I say, you could look it up. Any and every other action the president may choose to take under what I consider the phenomenally distorted and dictatorial view of the president's power as commander-in-chief. I will say bluntly that these memoranda are treason to the American Constitution. And then there is the signing statement in Broglio, uncovered and written about by Charlie Savage. Then there are views of apparently tens of millions of American citizens. And I have to say this because it's another bêta noire of mine. It's something else that people don't want to talk about and don't want to write about. They occasionally write about it in a very cleaned up way, saying that the South has enormous political power in this country. But there is the fact that apparently tens of millions, scores of millions of our citizens, led by those in the South, a one-party, one must say, since at least about 1850, a one-party section of the country, first after the Civil War, purely Democratic. Since Johnson said, with this stroke of the pen, we are giving up the South for the next 50 years, purely Republican. And this is, after all, the section of the country that gave us slavery, Jim Crow, and I think militarism. For those of you old enough to remember the two Mendels, Mendel Rivers and Mendel Davis. Tens of millions of people, scores perhaps, have voted twice now in presidential elections. I have to say that I was once one of them, in the first one. And in congressional elections, for a group that has turned out to be a bunch of felons, and who have been led extensively, we are finding out, by people who are grafters and worse. Then there is the historical fact that some of you will be aware of. You may agree or you may disagree, but you will be aware of the facts and ideas I have in mind, that since 1898, this country has been an imperialist nation. Mark Twain and others lost the battle in 1898, in 1899, in 1900, in 1901, 1902. Mark Twain and Carl Schurz lost the battle. And we have been an imperialist nation ever since then. And imperialism, almost by definition, connotes violence and military action. There is the cognate fact that in this country we are addicted to violence, both domestically and abroad, as well as in the movies and on television. Then there is the fact that the country is, most people in the country are basically pretty ignorant of history, of its lessons, of its patterns, and therefore, as Santayana said over 100 years ago, I think at this point it must be about 110 or 120 years ago, they are condemned to repeat history. And there is withal the all-encompassing fact, which I wrote a blog about recently, and to my amazement, this blog got 30 responses, only 3 of which said I was a moron. And I think that's a pretty low number based on what I said. And some were quite touching responses. One woman said she read it and she cried. Well, that's a bit much. But it got a very heavy response, heavier response than I've ever gotten before. The point of the blog was that we in this country are in the middle of a moral meltdown. And I think that's the ineluctable conclusion that you must draw. If you put together and look at collectively the host of things which have happened and are happening in this country. Because what do you call it but moral meltdown, moral breakdown? If you fight war after war, since we have since 1950, if you cause the death of tens of thousands in Iraq now, it's beginning to look as if directly or indirectly it's hundreds of thousands, and if you include Vietnam and Cambodia, it's millions of people. In causes that we in Vietnam, or many of our citizens as to Vietnam, and many of our citizens even as to Iraq currently, have come to think were very misbegotten causes indeed. When the country's leaders desire to torture and kidnap people, when they hold even innocent people in jail incommunicado for years on end, when the politicians who control this country seem to care about little or nothing except re-election and money, when we have corporations and investment banks and other financial houses that cooperate with all of this willingly, it's called part of the K Street Project, you know, and who are themselves riven with financial fraud, as has been discussed at our law school by John Bogle recently and on television for us by John Bogle, the famous founder of the Vanguard Funds. I think when you look at all of this collectively, you have to agree that we are in the midst of the kind of moral meltdown that war brings. It was not for nothing that the founders wished to avoid excessive or overly strong executive power, which tends to bring such disasters upon the country. Well, I've touched here on some, not all, but some of the phenomena which I think cause one to believe there is a crisis in our governing structure. I have not touched deeply on those which I mentioned. Many of the people who speak here will give you in-depth views on them. But I do wish to leave you with a particular thought as to why a person who was an adult, at least putatively, an adult at the time of Vietnam, as I was, might find the current state of the country to be depressing in the extreme. The thought is this: after Vietnam, who would have thought it could all happen again? Who would have thunk it, so to speak? Yet it did happen again, and there must be something fundamentally amiss for it all to have happened again. Thank you.